All right. Hello, homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and today, returning to the podcast, is my friend Joerg Rieger. And I'm pretty excited to have you back. How are you doing?
I'm great. Great to be back with you, Trip. Always enjoy our conversations and looking forward to this one.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's not every day that you talk one of your super nerdy friends into agreeing to answer questions that listeners send in that you haven't seen in advance. So, not only did George say yes, but he doesn't even know what's coming. So that's you feeling dangerous.
It could be a risk, but this is also what makes it fun to me. I love this sort of thing. So let's see what happens.
Yes. Well, we were talking the other day, and you started to share about the solidarity circles that you're recruiting people for, and I was like, oh, that sounds like so cool. We should answer some questions, and then it gives me a reason for you to tell everyone about what y'all are up to. So before we jump into the questions, I'd love for you to share a bit about the project around solidarity circles, and let people know about it. So if they are interested in connecting and being a part of it, they know what the next step is.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for checking in about that. So, Solidarity Circles is a project that we're running through the Wendland-Cook program in religion and justice at Vanderbilt. And people can actually look it up on our website, which is religionandjustice.org. So that's just one long word, religionandjustice.org. And there's a little button at the top, a little tab that you can click that says Solidarity Circles. What we're doing is we really want to bring churches and practitioners of solidarity economy together because we're beginning to realize that we all want to transform and reform the church, but you can't really reform the church unless you're also reforming the world. And so for us, going hand in hand in the solidarity circles is sort of a project of rethinking church, rethinking theology, reshaping theology in relation to reshaping economic relationships. And so for that, we're working with cooperatives, worker co-ops, all kinds of cooperative enterprises, all kinds of projects of the solidarity economy, which, if you want a quick definition, is really anything that's not top-down capitalism, that's not sort of one person, winner takes all kind of thing. And so putting solidarity economy praxis together with church praxis, I think is really promising because ultimately it reshapes both sides. So the church can actually make a difference in the way it usually can't. And the church is also transformed in a way that it usually isn't. When people just think about new things, it doesn't usually go very deep. So what we're doing is, put practice and theology together, church and world together. And we're doing that. The circles are really circles of, maybe about between a dozen and maybe 15, 18 people in each circle, which are all people from various places, various communities that care about these things, that actually want to make a difference. And for 9 months, once every month, for about an hour and a half, these groups meet. They talk to each other, they reflect together, they talk about their faith, about their experience, about their praxis, and they get some advice from, we have theologians, we have theological fellows, we have pastors, and we have people who actually practice solidarity economy. So all of that comes together. Hopefully, what will happen is some sort of nuclear fusion that sets off a lot of energy.
In the and this is something y'all have done before, and it worked well, and you're wanting to get the groups together again. What kind of ideas or situations of service are the ideal members to join?
So we had a pilot group in the spring where we did this with about maybe 25 churches, and we had all kinds of different projects. I mean, one church was actually working on a solidarity fund, fund, just helping, using their resources to fund projects in their neighborhoods. Other churches were thinking about using their buildings. Churches usually have buildings and land that's oftentimes not used very effectively. And then really all the way to incubating cooperative businesses. So one church community was actually thinking about incubating a cooperative childcare model. Here in Nashville, we're working closely with the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development, and they've incubated co-ops, from landscaping co-ops to African American owned trucking co-ops, to various other kinds of buildings, other kinds of projects. And so that's what these communities were engaging, and where we're helping from the Wendland-Cook program is really sort of to spark the theological imagination. How does reading the Bible help us build something differently? How does imagining God differently would actually make a difference? Usually people think of God somehow as a powerful guy in the sky. What if you think about God cooperatively? What you think about God in terms of how our relationships shape up from the bottom up rather than from the top down? So that's a bit the spirit. And other than that, we're really working with churches wherever they are, so nobody has to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes communities may have some projects that they want to take to the next level. That would be very welcome. They may already have some things where they're engaged. We help them build that, expand that. And what we're really hoping for, we're all Protestants to some degree. Well, not all, but a lot of us, is that leading to some sort of reformation, transformation that's bigger than just individual communities. But so it's about networks. It's about faith communities supporting each other, also sharing knowledge, sharing some of their motivation. Why do they care?
Yeah. And the website's religionandjustice.com.
Religionandjustice.org. Yeah, thanks.
All right.
So that's where you can find it.
And I'll
on
put
that
links
website,
on
of
the
course,
podcast. For everyone listening, I'll put the link on the podcast page so you can click through.
Yeah, thanks, Trip. So religionandjustice.org. And it also, that website shows you a lot of the work we're doing at the Wendland-Cook program, where ultimately what we're trying to do is really sort of bring questions of economic and ecological justice together with, forming and reforming, transforming faith communities. We're talking a lot about Christianity because that's one of the biggest problems, but we're also very interested in interreligious relationships. One of our academic fellows is a Muslim academic in New York City who's working as a lawyer, as a law professor, actually, with immigrant communities. And so we have really working on this intersectionally. So this is not just about economics and class. It's also about race, gender, sexuality, these kinds of questions, ethnicity, immigration, and so on.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited about it. And anyone that's interested, definitely reach out to Joerg and let him know. Now, we got sent in a bunch of questions, and I was quite excited about it. Now, here's a fun one for the first one, Joerg. Okay. Now, imagine Joerg has a magical eraser and can go back through church history and erase any theological idea that someone came up with, stuck around for a long time, or had ill consequences. If you got the magic theological erasure, what doctrine, doctrinal answer do you want to just erase it?
Well, this is a really good question. Thank you so much. I that would be worth a whole book, talking about what to erase. I mean, the first thing I really would say is any sort of images of God as operating from the top down, God's self, God in God's self, having some sort of weird power, waving magic wands, that make things happen in the world. I think the problem with that, of course, is that it copies images of the dominant rulers throughout the century. So, you go back in the Roman Empire, it was pretty clear there was a difference between Jesus and Caesar. Over time, sort of the two got assimilated. And of course, it wasn't that Caesar got assimilated to Jesus, but Jesus got assimilated to Caesar, which is one of the big problems in church history. And so God more and more was moved into these images of emperor. Today, it's really the image, not so much of emperor, but of, probably CEO of a corporation that has tremendous power to do anything, that entity wants. And then, of course, what that does is, if God is envisioned in these ways, the people that embody this are God. So, as was it Mary Daly once said, if God is male, male is God. You could also say, if God is CEO, CEO is God. If God is king, king is God. So that's where I would start with the erasing process, because I think that has done a lot of damage, because first of all, it supports the status quo. Whoever's at the top is automatically God. And whether that's, an American president or any other sort of politician, CEO, dictator in the world, you name it. That's the first problem. And the second problem is that it usually condemns those who are at the bottom to really despair and frustration, because God's never there. God is, unless God somehow pulls them up into the ruling class, there's no hope for them. And I think that's just awful, and that's terrible. Unfortunately, I think this is what most people think religion is. You think about some pie in the sky, and of course, there is all kinds of theological developments that feed straight into that. I mean, I could talk about that some more, but you may have other questions.
Oh no. I mean, I think it is a very tempting question, because you have to decide what to do with it. But as someone who has recently pulled out all of his Whitehead books, it's always nice when someone talks about how Caesar's lawyers got a hold of the image of God being utterly problematic for the history of the West. And one of the other questions that came in I think that's related to this was what's a theological vocabulary word that those of us who are more liberal Protestants need to learn to use more. And I think this question's helpful, because I always have that temptation, and since getting back in the U.S., I found that the religious situation is even crazier than I thought. Having been gone for 3 years, that the association for the association between Christianity, especially white Christianity in America, and the right in ugly ways, is even more culturally tied. That there is this desire to evacuate theological language or distinctively Christian imagery, and those of us that are liberal Protestants in America have been worried about that basically ever since Billy Graham took over as the most visible religious figure after Reinhold Niebuhr. I mean, talk about a downgrade. But is there a particular part of the theological tradition or part of that language that you think we're missing out on by letting it go to the right, or ceasing to use the idea and imagery?
Wow, that's another big question. I mean, things that come to mind immediately would be, notions of relationship. I mean, that. I mean, in a more classical term, you could even talk about covenant, because covenant is all about relationship, right? And for some people, of course, there's all kinds of conservative covenant theologies that basically, again, start from assuming God as some sort of an imperial figure that establishes a covenant, and then presses everybody inside the rules of this covenant. And then some people think about the covenant as established by divine law. Other people might talk about natural law. What's so striking to me is that a lot of these relationships and these covenants are basically just sanctifying dominant types of relationship. So you think about a hierarchical relationship, the way a company is run, for instance, top down by the CEO, that then gets imported into this idea of a covenant. So the heavenly CEO establishes a covenant with people, and all you can do is basically, watch and obey. Be obedient, follow the law, follow law and order, be quiet. My great grandmother, I remember her as a child in Germany, coming out of this German tradition, would always talk about, quiet and order. The first duty of the citizen, she said, is to be quiet and orderly. So that's sort of a relationship that looks like it's quiet and orderly, but it's usually just upholding the dominant status quo. So your question, what do we do with that? Well, I'd first say we need to recognize what relationships are already in place. This is where I'm actually differing from a lot of liberal hand wringing about, oh, we're all so individualistic, we're all so disconnected, we need to build relationships. The first thing is you need to realize how many relationships that are already in place and how distorted they are. There are these, hierarchical relationships in terms of authority, gender, patriarchy, you name it. Race, of course, is another big one that plays a role here. But I would say let's look at the labor relationship too. We're basically assuming that when you enter the workplace, you're leaving America, the democracy, and you're entering America, the hierarchical dictatorship, right? Because the boss is always right, and a lot of labor relationships are very strictly hierarchical, and the ones that aren't, they're becoming more and more so. That's even true for the universities. So it's this relationship thing. First of all, we have to point out how it works, and secondly, of course, what I'm excited about is reclaiming it. How do we reclaim them? That's the notion of solidarity and solidarity circles. How do we reclaim relationships? What options do we have?
Mhm. In your book that's about to come out, that I just started reading, about the capitalist scene, you talk about needing to develop solidarities to match the complexities that exist in our relationships, where all sorts of oppression and injustice are harbored. And a lot of those complexities in relationships are ones where we are often unaware of the way we're in that web of relations. The way you kind of expound solidarity there, and in previous work when you talk about deep solidarity, maybe before we do the next question, kind of expand on what you mean by solidarity as conceptually, but what is the invitation to take it seriously for people in communities of faith?
Yeah, that's a big question. But let's go back to, covenant and relationship, perhaps. If you think about covenant, you think of it. It could be this top-down model where sort of God taps little people on the shoulder, elects them, brings them into some sacred community, and everybody else is damned and doomed. We're thinking about another way to think about the covenant is sort of God entering into all kinds of relationships. While they are initiated by God, they're also very mutual. They're also, bi-directional. It's not just God doing everything, but God inviting the people to join, in the divine work. And then eventually, sort of in the Christian story, God's self then joins as a human being in these relationships. And of course, what gets people so angry about it is that he's not only building relationships, but he's overturning dominant traditional relationships that are harmful, that are hurting people. So if you think about solidarity in those terms, what kinds of relationships would actually help liberate people, would help people live a better life, would help people flourish rather than hold them captive. One thing I'm doing in the book, this is, the title is Theology in the Capitalocene, which we can talk about later. It's a tongue-in-cheek notion there. But what I'm basically saying is there's forms of solidarity that are actually detrimental to the flourishing of all and the community, because there's sort of a right-wing solidarity that basically does solidarity in terms of sameness. Nationalism is one of them. We're all in one nation. We're all the same. We all have to talk alike, look alike, think alike. Wave the same flag, and that's what binds us together. I'm coming from Germany. That's my background. And of course, we have some real problems with that thing, right? It's called fascism. And this sort of solidarity is absolutely toxic. Not only is it toxic because it ruins everybody else's life, it really even ruins the people's lives who are inside that solidarity, because it fools people to think us Germans or us Americans, we have something in common, and this is about us. Whereas in reality, whether it's nationalism or a lot of these things are usually helpful for the 1% at the top. They make everybody else believe, oh, you're American, you have to be for this and for that because it's American. You have to be for the American dream because it's American, even if it doesn't even work for you. So there's a form of solidarity that's really very dangerous. Racism is another example. It's sort of a white solidarity that's destructive for everything that's non-white. We know this, but it's even destructive for white people who are not benefiting all that much from this racism. Lower class white people made to believe that they have more in common with the white people at the top. Who live in Florida in mansions. We know some people like that, right? And they basically get fooled and sucked into it, so that everybody gets fooled. That's not the solidarity that I'm talking about. I'm talking about people realizing that in this current situation, what we have in common, Paul expressed this well in 1 Corinthians 12 when he talked about the church as the body of Christ. He says, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. That's sort of the basis of solidarity. If there's suffering, or as Martin Luther King Jr. Would say, injustice for one is injustice for all. In other words, what's happening to the least of these is happening to most of us. If the planet is in danger, we're all in danger. If people are exploited, chances are a lot more of us exploited. We don't even realize it. So solidarity is sort of this recognition of some connection that we have in the struggle because we are experiencing these pressures together. And then at the same time, very important to say, look, they're not affecting us all in the same way. There's still differences. So we're talking about solidarity not as sameness, but as recognizing how very different people are affected by similar pressures. And then to bring together this difference, not to make it the same, but to say, here's what I can contribute. Here's what somebody else can contribute. And the real key to it is to say leadership and the vision and guidance has to come from those who are experiencing the greatest pain in their own bodies. So it's really constructed from the bottom up, whereas this dominant right-wing solidarity is always constructed from the top down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the other questions that came in, this was I took the class you and Joerg did together. Since then, so much has happened globally, and we've gotten more distance from the experience of the pandemic and everything that was connected. Are there any particular learnings or takeaways that Joerg has made at this point about the future of global solidarity or thriving communities on the ground, or the future, if any, of the church?
Yeah. Wow. Let's start with the ground first, because I think this is really where a lot of my own learning has taken place. If you start on the ground, you'd have to say, one thing we learned in the pandemic is that they're essential workers. Because before that, we thought, well, working people are basically dispensable. What we need is great leaders. Even in the church, we're only talking about leadership. We're not talking about workers. We're not talking about people who are actually doing the work right on the ground. And so during the pandemic, we realized, there is no way forward. We cannot even survive without people who are actually doing the work. And so, of course, that then got bantered around. Not a whole lot happened because these essential workers, sometimes, they got maybe some flowers and some applause. There were even some churches that would go down to the grocery store, and try to be nice to essential workers. But it hasn't really quite reversed the way we think about the economy, hasn't really reversed the way we think about salary structures or benefits or all of that. And it hasn't either. It hasn't challenged the way we think about, what's non-essential work. If you think about the automobile industry, you cannot build a car without the person who is actually there putting in the bolts and the screws and guiding the robots. But you might be doing something without Elon Musk, even though people think Elon Musk is the most important person in the automobile industry or something like that. So that's one thing, looking at it from the bottom up. But the other thing that's really implanted itself for me is thinking about international relationships. And what came out of the pandemic, for a while, I usually travel a lot internationally. I didn't travel for probably over 2 years now. Well, I just traveled a lot this summer internationally again. But what we did, we had a lot of Zoom calls. And what I found was there is this deep resonance when you talk about the importance of working people and essential workers, because that's a common experience. That's not just in the US. They had this in Europe, Latin America, Australia, various places. And once you think about it, it really is something that produces international solidarity at a level that we've never really even had to touch before. And now, traveling again, what really amazed me was I was in Italy this summer, one of my trips at the European Academy of Religion. And there's now a younger group of scholars at the European Academy of Religion who are working on questions of economics, class, and labor. That never happened, not in the last couple of, I don't know, decades, a century or more, if ever. But it's there. There's certain foundations, that work along these lines that are picking up some of these questions again. And I think that's really exciting, because this is not just a pragmatic question. This is really a question about what really matters. And for me, at the core of the new book is to say, what is the ultimate concern? That's an old term that Paul Tillich, theologian, used. Is maybe what we're talking about here the ultimate concern, essential labor, and so on.
Yeah, I think that the that coming out of the pandemic, there is the hope that there are more people thinking the proper response to the kind of systems of injustice and the crises we're facing requires more than the heroic individual to address it. And yeah, the one of the questions that came in that I was like, oh, that's fun. What's the theological account of institutions? And I'm knowing the individual who sent it, they're on the cynical side towards most of the institutions that shape so much of our lives. But I'm interested in how we think theologically about institutions, and if kind of like going back to that kind of a question about like what is the purpose and meaning, and how do values instantiated it, does it help us think through kinds of transformations that are needed in so many of the institutions that are shaping a world that's threatening our host planet and so many people.
So there's the cynical account. I guess everybody knows it, right? That institutions are basically part of the fallen humanity, right? And institutionalization is always a bad word, because it also means ossification, or the loss of life, the loss of spirit, the loss of energy, and all of that. And we've seen this a lot. I mean, quite frankly, there's some reason for cynicism here. And I'm thinking, various institutions, big institutions that I've been a part of, still am, the United Methodist Church being one of them, Vanderbilt University, or, universities in general as institutions, where one could really show how not only is this thing, then being controlled and perhaps, slowing down and losing its life, but the bigger problem is that these institutions are oftentimes captured by dominant interests. And so that's what makes it so difficult, not just that it gets a little boring and deadly once in a while, but that it's sort of a place where dominant interests usually, interfere and try to shape things. However, having said that, I would say, if you think about alternative interests, there might be alternative institutions to be built. And that has also a long history. So we're not just saying, this is wishful thinking. We wish institutions were different, but what kinds of alternative institutions do we have? What kinds of organizations have actually worked to make a difference, even though they're not perfect and they're not immune from all the other problems institutions might have. And that, I think, is really interesting, because there you could think about the sort of stories that we're not always telling. So for that, of course, again, with this bottom-up theme, you might want to look at minority communities. What are some of the institutions that have actually helped the Black community in the United States to survive? Whatever the church does, the church has been helpful there. I mean, I was just a reader of a dissertation by an African American, very talented PhD student who wrote about the captivity of the church to neoliberalism, the prosperity gospel. That's certainly true. But on the other hand, there's a history of the Black church that really shows how this has been part of a progressive movement, how the Black church has actually helped people survive, build some power, change things. I mean, people wouldn't be surprised if I talk about the labor movement in this way, even though we know that the labor movement itself is also at points, a fairly problematic institution. That's true. But on the other hand, if people enjoy weekends of work as far as they can, 8-hour work days, protection for women at work, end of child labor, those are all things that come out of the labor movement and the institution called the unions and organized labor. So in this sense, I think one could list all kinds of things that have functioned, and whoever is part of an institution, I think, would have these opportunities to think about what's really possible here. What's the alternative outcome?
Mm-hmm. Do you think part of the predicament in the present is the, I don't know, growing visibility of the sickness of so many institutions, and that especially in America, I think, if you when I talk to people younger than me, that means they grew up in a world where our political institution is all post 9/11 and everything that came after it. Our church institution, think of all the child abuse scandals. There's you can go running through it. The economic system, you had the '08 crash, you have more with bailouts for billionaires and companies, and continuing to screw the middle class and the poor. So like the question, right? Like, you get where the energy comes from when people are just like, yeah, just burn it all down. And I think the common response from my elders has been like, do you have any idea what happens if you just get rid of all the institutions? So I think that we're at this moment where there's a growing population who didn't have experiences where most of these institutions worked well. And at this point, so many of the institutions that maybe have started, think public education has gotten, it now does a better job at keeping people where they were born and lowering them rather than raising them up. The university system, there's so many things that when the logic of neoliberalism took hold in these institutions, it did what it does, right? And I wonder if the kind of critical reflection that's needed is one that recognizes that the anger for burn it all down is legitimate, and yet there's a lot of people on the planet, and if we don't have institutions that run well and celebrate people for being vocationally committed to working in institutions with integrity, then it will just it's going to get worse. And it's a real frustrating predicament, because when you don't feel like you have agency and you see all these institutions and their perversity, sometimes the only thing you can do is yell burn it down and throw a match, right? Like at a stone giant. And I understand that. And that's I
Yeah.
yeah, I don't think there's a solution to it. I just I just
Well,
know the feeling.
yeah, and I mean, you don't want to blame anybody who feels that way because it is really bad. I mean, I agree that, I mean, talking specifically also about the church, there's some real deep problems, and ignoring those is not helpful. But I think what's missing in a lot of the critique of institutionalism is who is benefiting here, or in whose interest are these things being done. So for instance, when I travel in Africa, especially, there's many conversations about corruption. And we have that in the US too, right? You can talk about corrupt politicians. Probably could talk about corrupt pastors too, and maybe professors. It's maybe not quite so obvious, where the corruption is. But my question back to people who criticize corruption is always, and have you asked who is doing the corrupting? In whose interest is corruption happening? Who is providing the tools? Who is providing the money for corruption? And I think, especially when it comes to the church, that's a question we're not usually asking. And there may not be open corruption, that somebody's sending millions and billions of dollars to churches, but there's all these relationships in churches where money speaks, money makes a lot of decisions. That goes back to theological schools. What you can and cannot say is oftentimes determined by money, rather than just the fact that we're institutionalized or anything. The fact that institutions are going the way they're going, and I think that's true for education also, is where the money is flowing, where the money is put in, where it is withheld. And so that's another question. Before burning down the institutions, I think we might think about burning down that which holds captive the institutions.
Yeah. Okay. Here's one that's kind of related to the institution of the church. Now, you may not know this, but I occasionally go on rants, Joerg, about the ecclesiological vision that came out of Duke. Though I know you're an alumni, so I know this is tricky. This is tricky, but you're an alumni in a different era. So in North Carolina, as a graduate of Wake Forest University Divinity School, we have ACC basketball reasons to hate Duke. Then you have the Hauerwasian Mafia. And this questioner is asking this and I'm not supposed to say anything because they know that this is just a chance. It could trigger Trip ranting about the Hauerwasian Mafia for a long time. So I'm not going to answer that part. But the question was, when I was in Divinity School at Duke, don't do a rant, Trip. The vision of the church that so many of us bought into is one where the most revolutionary acts we do is the faithful application of Christian language, the removal of the American flag from a sanctuary, and confidence that our alien status in our neighborhoods is the very place the Christian mission finds its roots. Since then, I've become disillusioned with it and wonder if there's anything to learn from all the liberal theologians I learned to roll my eyes at Duke. So now I have a lot of things I'd say because I'd like to make rants about the Hauerwasian Mafia, but since I'm not allowed to say anything, what gifts do you think the larger liberal theological tradition and the movements of liberation have to give mainline Protestant ecclesiology and recovering from a world of aliens?
Yeah, no, this is a cool question, and keep in mind, like you said, I did my PhD at Duke. I know exactly whereof you speak. I finished a long time ago in '94, but that stuff was going around then, and a lot of my former colleagues are part of that mindset. Let me just say this. What always struck me as odd, even when I was there as a student, was that the church was seen in such an ideal light, which is just strange for those of us who actually live in churches and live with churches. Because if you're actually there and you know what's going on, you cannot idealize the church like that. And to say that the church in itself, just when it is the church, is this great force of resistance, There are some examples for that. I mean, there's some of that perhaps in Germany. But my tradition as a German Methodist, the German Methodist Church in the Third Reich exactly took this position, said, well, we're not fascist. We're not going along with the German Christians. We basically go in our churches and we do what we always did. And then we pray and sing and preach and read the Bible. No flags in our churches. Except when it was all done afterwards, in the aftermath, people realized that simply by stepping outside of the struggle, maybe you're becoming part of it on the wrong side, on the dominant side. And so simply, talking about resident alienship and all of that, without really being honest and clear about where the struggles are, where you have to participate, I think is really one of the fallacies of this approach. So you have, an idealist approach to the church that sounds good in a book and in a lecture, and you can have a lot of fun with it, but I just don't see it work. I mean, and then all you get is, well, but I like it this way. And that's sort of an approach that's worse than the worst liberal approach, because then it becomes just fluff. And that, I think, is perhaps doing the church a worse disservice than the liberal accommodation. Now, on the other hand, the liberal problem is that, liberals try to be so accommodationist, and try to be so hip, and up with the times, and just basically trying to see what's fashionable at the moment. That's not going to go very far either. And so for me, it's always, if you look at these two alternatives, a more traditionalist approach, a more liberal approach. By the way, I did a little diagram for a course that you and I did, this capital change course, actually, where I really showed whatever's called liberation theology as a different option. So this is not just sort of liberal liberation is the same thing, but liberation in many ways, in plural, not just one liberation, liberationist theologies, perhaps liberation theologies, are challenging both the liberal and sort of this weird church narcissism paradigm that believes that the church is the solution to everything. By the way, as a Christian, talking about God earlier, I really think that God is the solution to a lot of things, but I would never confuse God and the church. And that's part of the laziness, I think, that we're finding these days. Whereas the liberationist approach asks different questions. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but I just want to make sure it's not a matter of, we've seen the church model got stuck, and now we need reclaim some old liberal idea. There may be some other options here where we find God more closely related to life, more broadly conceived.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, well, I think, I mean, I think it'd be fun to explore kind of especially as someone who's spent time, learning and writing in with a host of different conversation partners and from different liberation theologies. Are there particular questions or practices or framings, right, for those leading congregations in the dominant part of the dominant culture right now in the world, where there are things we can learn that kind of push beyond kind of the stale accommodationist style and the I don't know, the faithful grammatical regurgitation style of ecclesiology.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, I mean, maybe talking specifically about ecclesiology here could be a good place to start. The assumption that, basically church is where the word church is written either on the entrance, or where you meet in a building with a steeple. I mean, I think even sort of the most traditionalist theologians would have to raise a question or two about this. So is this the church? Whoever says they're the church, or whoever claims to be a Methodist is now Methodism. I think that's where one would have to raise some critical questions. What is the church? And this is where I think in our own time, a sort of unreflected traditionalism is very dangerous. if you look on the other hand, sort of on this idea that anything and everything is the church, you might also missing something, because part of the church is making a commitment. Part of the church is following Jesus, and of course, some of the more classical words like discipleship and all of that. You could say, well, that's a great term, but what are we discipling people towards? And there, I would suggest, we might think about the church more. Fred Herzog, by the way, Frederick Herzog was a theologian who was very close. I was very close to when I was at Duke. I did part of my dissertation on him. Herzog would oftentimes, in this Duke context, raise a very different question. He would not start with the church. He would direct the church to ask a question like this: what is Jesus doing now? And then you try to figure that out. Don't assume that it's necessarily happening in the church, but you direct the church towards what Jesus is doing, and who's ever then organizing together with Jesus, building power together with Jesus, in a movement together with Jesus, that would be the church. And that's another conversation about who that is, but that's not an amorphous group necessarily. It's not anything and everybody. But it is people, it's like what people says, what Jesus says to his family. Who's my family? It's not my mother and my brothers and my sisters. It's not necessarily my professors and my Duke community, but it is whoever does the will of God. And that then decides. And what that will of God is, I think, is the much more interesting theological question, and to rethink the church from there. Instead of to think that the church somehow already got it, and all we need to do is look inside the package. And there may not be a whole lot there these days in a lot of places.
Yeah. Do you? How do you see that question around the theological inheritance of the church? Like, in some sense, we are called and participate in the work of God in the present on our best days, and yet also we are complicit and broken and guilty in all sorts of other ways. And I think part of what those that critique kind of more liberal accommodationist ones, what they're rightly pointing out is that when you accommodate and you can no longer talk about things like sin and grace and these kinds of things, you can't talk about the love of God revealed and enacted in Christ without crossing your fingers and adding like Jesus as the Christ, between adding things between Jesus Christ and stuff like that. The animating energy of the church is tied to God's self-testimony in the history of Israel and the person of Jesus in some unique and particular ways, and the results of sorts from the more accommodationist style of mainline Protestantism in America has been an account of the gospel that isn't compelling to a growing number of its kids, even if they adopt our shared ethical commitments or something. How do you understand as a theologian that tension of honoring, wrestling with, or taking account of language having traction in God as God has revealed God's self?
I mean, I think it has to go back to the notion of sin, first of all, because, this is where, that's, of course, an old critique, right? Where liberalism is usually a little weak. It doesn't have a very strong understanding of sin. And for that reason, of course, it cannot fight sin and evil well either. This is a lesson that you could learn by studying what happened in Nazi Germany. The liberals were not the ones that actually stood up and fought. And I think we see that today too. The liberals might want to help, might want to be more inclusive, might want to be more hospitable, but they're not usually the ones that expose the big structures and fight them, because there's not a strong notion of sin. So that's a real problem. So language around sin and evil. I mean, I'm all for recovering a lot of strong traditional notions all the way to original sin. Sin, death, the devil. Those are all notions, I think, that we have to reclaim, not just because this is cool theological work. I mean, I think it's actually quite exciting, but because a lot of this goes around all the time. Lots of people die. The planet is dying. Species are dying. There's real death happening, and it's not by accident. This is why the new book, my new book, is titled "Theology in the Capitalocene," not theology in the Anthropocene. And of course, this goes back now to the other side, sort of the traditionalist theologians. They basically want to talk about humanity as being all sinful. So theology in the Anthropocene would say, well, all humans are just basically fallen creatures and sinful, and we have to blame everybody. Usually, when that happens, the blame goes to those who cannot defend themselves. The widows, the orphans, and the strangers, and the poor and the immigrants, and you name it. Black people, people from other countries, and so on. That's not the point. I mean, the Capitalocene names the dominant power in our own age, which is not humanity in general, but humans that are basically running this system called capitalism. And when you think about this as sin and evil, I think you can really see these big relational distortions. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the distortion of relationships as the fundamental problem. And this is where I have a huge problem with traditionalist and conservative theologians. They talk about sin all the time, but they talk about it in such a way that it's completely harmless and irrelevant. It basically says, well, you're a sinful person, and all you have to do is repent and say you're sorry. That's not how you fight structures. That's not how you seriously address sin. That's just how you build another institution that then benefits from you feeling bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the oftentimes the narrowing of sin to individuals' actions turns prayers of forgiveness. They become about as flippant as like you hurting someone's feelings and being like, "Oh, my bad," and you're like that counts. You're like, "Oh yeah, that's my bad." Where you aren't even able to acknowledge one's own participation and agency and contribution to the system.
There's some great things happening now. One thing I really appreciate about teaching at Vanderbilt Divinity School is that a lot of my students have an understanding of sin as being structural. And so then racism is structural, sexism is structural. That's definitely a move in the right direction. The problem is that we're not even quite clear what those structures are, and so that still needs some analytical work and also some theological work. What is it exactly that's going on here? Is this just human nature, or are there some real things that that's the original sin part, that are not based in the individual, but that are somehow part of a culture, part of a nation, part of an economic system, capitalism, to be sure, that gets passed down from one generation to the next, that we have to address if we really ever want to make a difference. So those are deep theological questions, and for that, I think one could reclaim some of the biblical imagery, but you could also reclaim a lot of the classical theologians who had fairly strong notions of sin, death, and the devil.
I was looking for your book. What's the name of the one, real thick one that kind of goes through the figures in church history?
Christ and Empire.
Yes, there you go.
From Paul to post-colonial time is the subtitle. Christ and
Yes.
Empire. Yeah.
Oh, I love that book, and I've assigned chapters of it a number of times, especially in very liberal Protestant circles. I like assigning the Anselm chapter just to see what happens.
I mean, the Anselm chapter is really fascinating. I mean, what I'm doing in the book, just quickly for your listeners, I go through 7 examples in 2,000 years of church history and show how, on the one hand, our images of Christ have been shaped by empire, and how, on the other hand, there have always been resistance traditions inside the church. And so Anselm, in some ways, is on both sides. I mean, he's an empire theologian, to be sure. He's one of the early Norman archbishops of Canterbury, coming from Normandy, occupying the British Isles. and that makes him not only an imperialist, but some of his theology goes in that direction. Yet, on the other hand, Anselm is the theologian that reminds us that we haven't taken sin seriously enough. And so Anselm, in that sense, is actually much more in sync with liberation theologies, as I read him, who are also worried about the structural notion of sin. I'll give you a little Latin quote. This is Anselm and Boso in the middle of the book, sort of. Boso, by the way, is not the clown, but the theologian who is the conversation partner of Anselm in that book. So Boso, in the middle of this book, they're talking about sin, and Boso says, so sin is horrible, but what would keep me from just repenting and therefore, getting rid of my sin? And Anselm says, this is all in Latin, nondum considerasti quanti pontere sit peccata. You have not yet considered the weight of sin. And then they go on and say, well, so simply saying I'm sorry, simply praying, I mean, Anselm doesn't use that language, but I'll use it. Simply praying the sinner's prayer so that you go to heaven. Forget it. That's not what Christianity is all about.
Yeah. No, it's a wonderful book. If you haven't checked it out, you should go do it. And and you can always play the game. Reclaim Anselm in a context where you're only hanging out with very progressive Protestants. It's a fun game. Be like, I think Anselm's awesome. Anyway, so there are a few fun questions here for the end. Matt, everyone that's listening, if you have other questions you'd like Joerg and I to hang out and talk about, feel free to send them my way, or you can come hang out with us at Theology Beer Camp, because that's what all the cool kids are doing. And we'll be right next to Duke, Joerg. Well, you'll be right next to your stomping grounds.
We should go pay a visit. Yeah, have a talk, have a conversation. I mean, there's some good people. Don't get me wrong. I'm not completely down on Duke, but I'm down on a theology that romanticizes the church. Fred Herzog had it right. He would always say, the task is not to romanticize the church, but to analyze the church. And by analyzing, of course, he didn't mean make it look bad or be overly critical, but figure out what the problem is, figure out what it needs, and work on it, instead of talking about the ideal church, which most of my old friends who were so romantic about the church never found either. It's not like they found this place somewhere in North Carolina in the woods that was the perfect. That doesn't exist.
Well, we'll find out. I'm going to keep searching around the woods here, and I'll let you know if I find the perfect spot in the North Carolina woods, Joerg.
There's some cool places, though. I mean, I'm thinking about some places, say the work that Anthony Smith is doing in North Carolina, or some other people. So yeah, again, there's certainly, it's not like every church is basically a failure right out of the box, but it takes some work, and that's what I'm excited about. This is why I do theology, to help. This is why we do these solidarity circles at the Wendland-Cook program, to really help revitalize the church and the world together.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we are starting. This is the beginning of a fall semester. When you look at the syllabus and you're going through them for the classes you're teaching, what book are you getting to teach this semester that you're super excited about getting to open back up?
That's a good question. So I'm teaching this fall. I'm really only teaching one course: theology, economics, and labor. So a lot of these books have to do with the topic of theology and labor, and a lot of people think, well, that's mainly ethics anyway. But there's a lot more to it. One of my favorite authors from Latin America is a person by the name of Jung Mo Sung. And we are reading some of Jung Mo Sung's work again. The book on can't remember the exact title now, Desire and Religion, and that's always an eye opener to students. We're reading a book that's co-authored by a German and a German who's lived in Latin America for a long time, Ulrich Duckroff and Franz Hinkelamert, Transcending Greedy Money, which is talking about the history of how not only Christianity but really the Abrahamic traditions all the way to the early Jewish traditions emerged in sort of this changing world situation where money was taking over more and more of people's lives. Already the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, of course, are pointing that out. The Jesus movement is pointing that out, and the church never stopped pointing it out. In some places, of course, not the whole church. And what Duchrov and Hinkelhammer are talking about is also, other religions who've come alongside the Abrahamics, of course, Judaism and Islam, but also Buddhism. There's a lot of interesting conversations going on. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my own book, Theology in the Capital Scene. That's going to be in print end of August, and it'll be the first time I've used this in a class. So you do this with fear and trembling, because sometimes you wonder what students are going to do with it, and
Yeah.
they might. There's always some pushback involved, which is a good thing, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pushback usually occurs because they actually read it. Like, you don't like fake reading and give pushback in class when the author is also your professor. So you mentioned before when we were talking that you have been working through writing a systematic theology, which just sounds like about a peak excitement for me. As you've been thinking through what is it like to compose a systematic theology and things, has there been some a figure that in rereading them and kind of preparing to go through the doctrines in that kind of way that you reread and were like, oh wow, you found something new or exciting or kind of reignited a passion for a particular thinker's contribution?
That's a great question. I'm usually pretty pluralistic when it comes to figures, so I'm not usually just into this or that kind of theologian. But thinking about Christology as one example, what really struck me as very interesting, where some of these popular traditions about the historical Jesus in the United States that were almost forgotten. And there's a book that I found especially helpful by a historian, David Burns, The Life and Death of the Radical Historical Jesus. And what Burns is talking about is, all these American figures sort of between 150 and 100 years ago that had a very deep understanding of the radical nature of the historical Jesus, not just as a prophet and as a wisdom preacher and a sage, but really as an organizer who was building people's movements and who was doing that with real divine power. This is something that nobody really knows in my field. When people talk about the historical Jesus, they think about sort of this German liberal tradition that Albert Schweitzer then in the end critiqued, said, well, they all turn Jesus into their own image. Well, that's sort of the old critique. We've heard this 1,000 times. They probably banter this around at almost every theology school you can imagine. And then, of course, you have the Jesus Seminar, which is also doing, some things. They want to be a little bit more careful. But in the Jesus Seminar, Jesus often comes out as sort of, a wisdom preacher, a sage, and all of that. The real radical organizer is something that we're still reclaiming at this point. And so there are some names, Sarinus, Osborne, Ward, that probably people have never even heard of, some others. In contemporary literature, somebody who's sort of also talking about Jesus as an organizer is Richard Horsley. And I don't know how much Horsley picks up from these old traditions, but there's some real parallels. And the exciting thing is when you read these ancient biblical traditions in light of contemporary movements from a people's perspective, whenever that happens, I think you can learn something, even though I'm not saying they have all the insights and all the truth. But that's usually what's most exciting to me. So that's an example in the historical Jesus. But there's also some example, even when you talk about otherwise boring stuff like Prolegomena, the big introduction to a systematic theology that now has to put out the method and all the philosophy behind it. What I find really interesting, is sort of Gramsci's notion of the organic intellectual, or other sort of people's traditions where you really pick up the radical stuff that neither the liberals and certainly not the conservatives even know exists.
Yeah, it is a uh yeah, I think that time period is pretty wild, like thinking like 150 years ago. Like even that's during the social gospel movement as well. Recently when I moved back, I went through all my books, and in my master's work, I did a big uh, seminar on the social gospel movement and got the Baptist Student Union's devotional written by Walter Rauschenbusch. And he had these 40 short devotionals that, I've, uh, other than like the obvious things in it that are dated linguistically or uh, the examples he gives, um, but the vision of Jesus, like as community organizer, like the whole thing are like, let me tell you about the parable or the teachings of Jesus. Here's it in history. And what is he doing? These are the principles we organize the life of the church around. And then there are these prayers there. And underneath it, what I found striking, picking it up and then having trouble putting it back down, is like all the passion and energy you normally think of being just the part of the church that can't think systems, structures, and institutions. All that energy sitting there. And he's like, look at Jesus. You get to be a part of a community that is committed to the flourishing a life of all living things. And to be a part of that community in a context of grace, you get to confess your sins, the ones you're aware of and the ones you'll come aware of later. Like it's just this like beautiful picture, and you're like, oh, this is cool. And and in his mind, he's like, we're just once you do a little Bible research, this is what he was up to.
I mean, this is utterly exciting stuff, and I think, if people really let or engage this material or let themselves be moved by it, all kinds of things can happen, which is, of course, why Reformation movements and also liberation movements oftentimes go back to these ancient resources. And of course, Jesus is one, the central one for Christians, but there's a lot of other material in our sacred scriptures and in our theological traditions.
Yeah. Okay. So the last question, Joerg, what song, when you're driving down the road by yourself, if it comes on, do you feel the need to turn it up and sing along?
Wow.
Because we know you've written on going on road trips.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so I'm wondering, like, what's the Joerg Rieger road trip like? Oh yeah, this is a greatest hit on the playlist.
This is a difficult one because a lot of things come to me in German, sort of German stuff that your listeners might not know. But there's one I'm trying to think about. What is this one about Mary? This is a Bruce Springsteen tradition. It's an old spiritual where he talks about um, the revolutionary part of Mary. I cannot think of the title right now. Man, that one gets me all the time.
So if you're by yourself, you're going to listen to predominantly German music.
So for your listeners, I used to ride a lot on my motorcycle.
Yeah.
I mean, not just around for fun, but I might come to North Carolina to beer camp on the motorcycle. So I take these trips, going places. And I don't have any earplugs, so I put in earplugs to be silent, so not any music. So a lot of the music is just sort of in my head, and a lot of that, especially the American part, comes to me. Traditional African American spirituals, go down Moses, or some of the because like swing low sweet chariot is another one that oftentimes comes to me, because this is one of those songs that we used to sing in Germany, actually in English, and we thought this was all about going to heaven. This was all about sort of the typical Moses being a religious leader, sweet chariot swinging down, taking us up to heaven. or sometimes I feel like a motherless child. You think, well, everybody has problems. Rich people have problems too, and all of that. And what I'm realizing, riding my motorcycle, especially through the American South, is how this is really tied to people's experiences, how much suffering, how much struggle there was, and how many people were affected by that, and of course, how many people don't really know a whole lot about it. And so for me, sort of reclaiming some of the African American spiritual tradition that way is really a reminder of how theology, religion, Christianity is about movements. It's not about going to heaven. It's about, the Underground Railroad, or it is about a liberation struggle. It is about, giving expression to your suffering, but never to get stuck there. It's talking about sin and evil, but it's always with an eye, with a hope towards salvation. So that sort of thing for me is probably what moves me most deeply. So that Springsteen rendition, and I cannot think of the title, sorry, right now. That's yet another rendition of an old African American spiritual where Mary, basically, Mary, don't you weep. Mary, don't you weep is the one.
Yeah.
That's extremely powerful because that ends. Sometime this world is gonna rock. It's gonna change. It's gonna be transformed, and that hope is certainly not pie in the sky. That to me is probably the biggest takeaway musically. And then there were some, in my background in Germany, I was part of a folk music band that did a lot of music. Protest music. We were protesting all kinds of things: American rearmament in Europe, nuclear power plants, environmental devastation, sexism, and so on, racism, even. Those are the songs that are probably, and I know the words to most of them, so I've memorized them. Yeah.
I don't know why I knew this, but I knew that David Hasselhoff was much more popular in Germany as a musician than in America. And I'd been told this enough that it was in my head. And this summer, when I was in Munich, a couple times in restaurants, David Hasselhoff was playing. And I thought, so that's not even an exaggeration, because I heard it in multiple restaurants. And I thought, what is this? Why does this song sound so 80s? And then, Shazammed it on the phone. It was David Hasselhoff. I was like,
is he still active, or is this was in the past? I know that he was quite popular for a while. I don't know if that's still the case now.
Oh, I don't know. You know how restaurants have mixes of popular songs that playing in the background.
Right.
And I was like, wow, there we go. There you go. I thought it was just one of those things Americans say, David Hasselhoff, real popular music in Germany. And then, I was like, well, if you're going to get coffee in Munich, I had a pretty high batting average for hearing David Hasselhoff while I was in a coffee shop.
It's funny. Yeah, that wouldn't be on the top of my playlist for sure, and it's certainly not in the back of my mind when I think music. But the funny thing is, I really don't listen a whole lot to music. It's more in my head, and I do play some music. I have a piano and a guitar and that sort of thing. I mean, this you got me started on this, but there's a lot more, where in the American tradition, I think there's a lot of really cool music that's sort of in a way that could take us back to what we're talking about, some of these roots. And that's definitely liberationist. I mean, I don't know why people can't see that. People think liberation theology is an import from Latin America or something like that.
Yeah, well, Americans can sing all sorts of songs without having any clue what they were talking about. I remember there's a video from one of Donald Trump's recent rallies, and there's these two guys with painted chest of American flag and their MAGA hat on, swinging stuff around, dancing to Rage Against the Machine. And I was just like, I don't think you understand how this works. It was like, they were like bulls on parade. You know what that's about?
It gets appropriate. I mean, that's another example of appropriation. Of course, liberals usually get accused of that, but appropriation, accommodation. But no, it happens everywhere.
Yeah. Well, this has been a blast. Thank you for hanging out, taking questions you didn't know it was coming, and I think you did great. I like your answers. See, I'm glad you didn't prepare.
Well, this is a real challenge. I love doing it. Maybe I need to give shorter answers. Sometimes it gets a little long, but those are really good involved questions, and I also want to honor the way these questions are phrased. So thanks for the questions. I really appreciate those who send them in. And this is one thing I like most in the classroom, except that today sometimes I feel my students are not raising these kinds of questions anymore. I don't know if there's something going on in the classroom or people policing themselves or whatever it is. But I really wish people were raising these kinds of questions more, and want to encourage it. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad people sent them in. And remember, anyone, you're more than welcome to send in other questions. Let me know. Save it for next time Rieger's on. You can come hang out with us at Theology Beer Camp, where we'll see if we talk Joerg into joining karaoke for a protest song at night. The volume of karaoke late night at beer camp is high, Joerg. High. So just but if he shows up in his motorcycle, it'd be impressive. The first time we met when I was a PhD student, and you and your brother showed up in motorcycles at Claremont, I was like, I already had read your books, and I'm like, I already liked you. And I was like, wow, he must be really cool. I wonder if I could be his friend. Like,
it's part of my spiritual formation, I think. So that's one reason. It gives me time to think, and it gives me time to focus on certain things. And also, if you travel this way through America or any other country, you're much closer to the people, and people will talk to you and chat you up, and you feel like you're more inside the world instead of just watching it through some windows.
Yeah. Awesome.
Anyway,